On a gray afternoon when rain streaked the windows of the tallest building in the financial district, Olivia Harrington happened to glance toward the private banking counter and saw a short string of numbers that made her blood turn cold. It was an account code, spoken aloud by a teller to confirm a small payment. Nothing more than a routine transaction between a customer and a bank clerk. But Olivia knew that code. She had seen it 100 times on wire transfer confirmations that crossed her desk over the years, each one authorizing exactly $1 million, sent out like clockwork every single month for 14 years. The man standing at the counter wore a faded maintenance uniform, drove an old pickup truck parked outside, and lived a life so plain that no one would ever suspect he held any connection to the Harrington fortune. Why had her father never once spoken his name? And what secret had the entire Harrington family been protecting for more than a decade? Daniel Carter was 39 years old, a systems maintenance technician who kept the electrical wiring of Harrington Tower running without a single complaint in nearly 6 years of service. He arrived before sunrise and left after the offices emptied, carrying a canvas tool bag that had been repaired so many times the stitching had become its own kind of history. His apartment was a modest one-bedroom on the edge of the city, sparsely furnished, with a single photograph on the nightstand of a woman who had passed away long before this story began. He had no children, no family waiting for him at home. Only the quiet rhythm of a life built around discipline and routine, the kind of routine a man builds for himself when grief has taught him that comfort is often found in small, repeatable things. He kept his shoes by the door in a straight line, his coffee cup washed and set upside down to dry before he left each morning, and his bills paid on the same day of every month without exception. On weekends, he sometimes drove out to a small cemetery, an hour outside the city, sat quietly beside a single headstone for an hour or two, and drove home again without ever mentioning it to anyone at work, a private ritual that had nothing to do with the fortune once tied to his name, and everything to do with a grief he had learned to carry gently rather than let it define him. Colleagues in the building assumed he was simply a man of limited means, someone who had never caught a break, and they treated him with the casual kindness people reserve for those they believe need it. What none of them knew was that Daniel often stayed late to fix a flickering light in the break room without logging the extra hours, or that he quietly repaired a jammed printer for the accounting department on his own time, never asking for a thank you and never accepting one when it was offered. Once, when a young intern locked herself out of a server room during a storm and panicked about a deadline, Daniel appeared within minutes with a spare key card he was not technically supposed to carry, said nothing about it afterward, and simply returned to his rounds as though nothing had happened at all. He kept to himself in the elevator, nodded politely to executives who never looked twice at him, and moved through the marble lobby like a shadow that belonged there but was never truly seen. On the day Olivia Harrington walked through the building for a surprise inspection of the maintenance division, she passed within 3 feet of him and did not register his face at all. To her, he was simply another name on a staff roster, one line among hundreds in a company that employed thousands of people across 4 continents, and she had learned long ago that a chief executive could not afford to notice every face in a building that size. At 36, Olivia was the sole heir apparent to Harrington Capital, a financial institution her father built from nothing into an empire worth billions. She had inherited his sharp intelligence and his cold precision, but she carried an exhaustion that came from being groomed her entire life for a role she had never been allowed to question. Every dinner of her childhood had doubled as a lesson in leverage and negotiation. Every vacation cut short by an emergency call from the trading floor, until she could not remember a version of herself that existed apart from the family name stitched into every door of that tower. The board was preparing to finalize a $5 billion acquisition that would double the firm's market position, and every director in that room understood that whoever controlled that deal would control the company's next decade. Pressure had been building for months. Phone calls at midnight, spreadsheets that multiplied like weeds, and a growing sense that her father's health was failing faster than anyone wanted to admit. Then came the call that changed everything. Edward Harrington, 68 years old and the founder of the empire that bore his name, collapsed in his study and was rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night. Olivia stood in a sterile hallway under fluorescent lights, listening to doctors speak in careful, measured tones about heart strain and stress, and the need for absolute rest, and she understood without being told that the full weight of the company was about to land on her shoulders, alone. She had wanted control for years, had trained for it, had sacrificed for it. But now that it was finally being handed to her in the worst possible way, she felt something close to fear for the first time in a long while. She sat beside his bed until the early hours of the morning, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, and wondered how a man who had always seemed indestructible could look so small beneath a thin hospital blanket. That same evening, in the quiet of his small apartment, Daniel's phone rang once. He answered without a greeting, listened for only a few seconds, and then said the words that would echo through the rest of this story, like a bell struck in an empty room. "This month's transfer has arrived," the voice on the other end confirmed, and Daniel simply nodded to no one, set the phone down, and looked out the window at the rain falling over a city that had no idea who he really was. He walked to a small drawer beside his bed, opened it briefly, and looked at a single folded letter he had kept there for 14 years, without ever showing it to another living soul, then closed the drawer again and went to sleep as he did every night, undisturbed by the weight of a secret only 2 men in the world truly understood. The following week, Daniel walked into the same private banking branch where Olivia's family had held accounts for 3 generations, intending only to pay a small utility bill that had somehow been routed through an unusual channel years earlier and never changed. He waited patiently in line behind 2 other customers, his jacket still damp from the rain outside, betraying nothing of the tension that so often surrounded conversations about money at that particular institution. When it was his turn, a young teller pulled up his account and read a portion of the routing code aloud to confirm the transaction, a habit drilled into every new employee at that branch for security verification. The numbers rolled off her tongue quickly, almost carelessly, the way people recite things they have said 1,000 times before without truly hearing them, never imagining that a few careless syllables could unravel a secret buried for 14 years. Olivia happened to be seated in the private VIP suite, just beyond a glass partition, finalizing a transfer of her own with a senior banking officer, close enough to catch fragments of the conversation happening at the public counter. The moment those digits reached her ears, something inside her chest seized painfully, and she set down her pen without realizing she had stopped moving at all. She knew that sequence of numbers as intimately as she knew her own signature, because she had seen it appear on wire authorization forms delivered to her father's office every single month for as long as she could remember being trusted with financial oversight. 14 years of transfers, always exactly $1 million. Always processed on the 15th of the month, always routed to the same account, with no explanation ever attached to the paperwork. A detail so consistent, she had once assumed it was simply an old contractual obligation, too tedious to question. Her father had always waved away her questions about it with a tired smile, calling it a private matter. An old obligation, nothing she needed to concern herself with. She had accepted that answer as a younger woman still learning the business, but standing there now with her heart pounding against her ribs, she understood that the man, every crisis the company had weathered in 14 years. She rose from her chair, walked to the glass partition, and watched Daniel Carter sign a simple receipt and leave the branch without a single glance in her direction, his old truck waiting for him just outside in the rain. For a long moment she simply stood there, forehead nearly touching the cool glass, replaying the sound of those numbers over and over in her mind until she was certain she had not imagined them. Within an hour, Olivia had summoned the head of internal compliance to her office and demanded a full trace on the account tied to that routing code, expecting a straightforward answer within the day. Instead, she was told that the account records had been sealed under a security classification typically reserved for matters involving the founder's personal legal affairs, a designation that required Edward Harrington's own authorization to unlock. She sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at a blocked file on her monitor, feeling for the first time in her adult life that her father had kept something from her that mattered enormously. The rain continued outside, steady and relentless, mirroring the quiet storm building inside a woman who had never once been denied information she asked for, and who was not accustomed to sitting with a question she could not immediately answer. She thought back to a dinner years earlier, when she was still a young associate learning the family business, and had asked her father in passing why one particular wire transfer never seemed to appear on the standard quarterly reports circulated to the executive team. He had simply refilled her wine glass, changed the subject to a merger they were negotiating at the time, and she had let the question drift away because there had always been so many more urgent things demanding her attention. Now, sitting in the silence of her office, she wished desperately that she had pressed him harder that night, instead of allowing the conversation to slip so easily into something else. Rather than confront her father immediately while he lay recovering in a hospital bed, Olivia chose a different path, one that suited her analytical nature far better than an emotional conversation ever could. She arranged for a discreet security team to observe Daniel Carter's daily patterns, telling herself it was simple due diligence, the kind of background research any responsible executive would conduct before making assumptions. The reports that came back over the following days painted a portrait that made no sense against the backdrop of 14 years and millions of dollars. Daniel lived without extravagance of any kind, drove the same aging truck to work every morning, ate at the same modest diner near his apartment, and showed no evidence of hidden wealth, offshore accounts, or lavish spending habits anywhere in his life. He owned no real estate beyond his rented apartment, held no investment portfolio that anyone could locate, and had never once purchased anything resembling luxury in the years the security team could trace. Each month, when the transfer arrived in his account, the money sat there for only a matter of days before nearly all of it moved out again, routed to an anonymous trust whose beneficiaries were impossible to identify through any conventional channel. Olivia stared at the reports with growing confusion, because nothing about this pattern matched a man secretly enriching himself, and nothing about it matched blackmail or extortion either, since Daniel never seemed to pressure anyone or make demands of any kind. She read the surveillance summaries twice, then a third time, searching for the flaw in the pattern that would confirm her original suspicion, and finding instead a portrait of restraint that unsettled her more than greed ever could have. When she raised the matter cautiously with Marcus Reed, the company's ambitious chief financial officer, his reaction surprised her with its intensity. Marcus, a polished man of 48 who had spent a decade angling for greater influence within the firm, urged her firmly to abandon the inquiry altogether. "Don't dig any deeper," he warned her, insisting that some matters belonged strictly in the past, and that disturbing them could destabilize the company at the worst possible moment, just as the $5 billion acquisition was reaching its final stage. His urgency, rather than easing her concerns, only sharpened them, because Olivia had built her entire career on trusting instinct over comfortable explanations, and every instinct she had was now screaming that something important was being hidden from her. She thanked Marcus for his advice, gave him nothing in return, and made a private note to watch him just as closely as she was watching the man in the maintenance uniform. Determined to find answers herself, Olivia visited the hospital where her father remained under observation. Walking into his private room, with the same directness she brought to every boardroom negotiation, she asked him plainly about the account, about the 14 years of transfers, about the man in the maintenance uniform, who seemed to have no idea his own name carried such weight within her family's private ledgers. Edward Harrington, propped against pillows with monitors humming quietly beside his bed, said nothing at first, his eyes drifting toward the window as though searching for words that had been buried for a very long time, the silence stretching long enough that Olivia began to wonder if he had heard her at all. When Olivia finally spoke Daniel's name aloud, something shifted in her father's expression that she had never witnessed in 36 years of knowing him. Tears gathered in his eyes, unbidden and unashamed, and his hands trembled slightly against the white hospital blanket as he struggled to compose himself. "You are not ready to know this yet," he told her quietly, his voice thick with an emotion she could not place, somewhere between grief and gratitude, and something that resembled shame. Olivia sat frozen in the chair beside his bed, watching the most powerful man she had ever known dissolve into vulnerability over the mention of a maintenance worker's name, and for a moment she forgot entirely about the acquisition, the board, and every other pressure waiting for her back at the tower. She pressed him further, demanding at least some explanation, some thread she could follow toward understanding. But Edward only shook his head slowly against the pillow. "Trust Daniel," he finally whispered, gripping her hand with more strength than she expected from a man recovering from cardiac strain. "Whatever you find, whatever you think you understand, promise me you will trust him before you judge him," he said. And then he closed his eyes as though the effort of speaking had drained the last of his energy. Olivia left the hospital that night, more unsettled than she had been before the visit, carrying a request she did not yet understand how to honor, and driving home through empty streets with her father's trembling voice replaying over and over in her mind. It was Helen Brooks who finally offered Olivia the thread she needed to begin unraveling the truth. Helen, 62 years old, and the family's former housekeeper for over 3 decades, had remained close to the Harringtons long after her formal employment ended, treated more like an aunt than staff in the family's private moments. She arrived at Olivia's apartment one evening carrying a pot of tea and an expression that suggested she had been waiting years for someone to finally ask the right question. 14 years ago, Helen began, settling into a chair across from Olivia, with the careful pacing of someone about to tell a story that mattered. Your family stood at the very edge of losing everything it had built, and she folded her hands in her lap the way she always did, when she was about to say something she had promised herself she would only say once. The company had been quietly bleeding money through a scheme none of them fully understood at the time, a betrayal orchestrated by trusted partners who had manipulated contracts and drained liquidity until bankruptcy loomed only weeks away. There was a man, Helen continued, a young financial analyst who uncovered the fraud before anyone else noticed, who used every asset he personally owned to guarantee emergency loans that kept the company from collapsing entirely. He negotiated directly with creditors through sleepless nights, structured an emergency recovery plan that saved tens of thousands of jobs, and asked for absolutely nothing in return beyond one single condition that your father swore to honor for as long as he lived. Helen paused there, watching Olivia's face carefully, as though gauging whether she was ready to hear the rest of it. She had served the Harrington household long before Olivia was born, had watched Edward build the company from a single rented office into a name recognized across the entire industry, and had also watched the toll that ambition took on a man who rarely allowed himself to rest. She remembered the night, 14 years earlier, when Edward had come home pale and shaking, locking himself in his study for hours, and how he had emerged the next morning a different man, calmer somehow, as though a weight impossibly large had finally been shared with someone strong enough to help carry it. Olivia listened in stunned silence, as Helen described how that man had refused every offer of equity, every attempt at public recognition, every reward Edward tried desperately to press upon him. He only wanted quiet repayment, spread across many years, so that no one would ever know the company had needed saving at all, and so that his own sacrifice would never become a headline or a bargaining chip for anyone. Helen's eyes glistened as she finished the story, and Olivia understood, with a chill spreading through her chest, that the man Helen was describing and the maintenance worker she had been secretly investigating were almost certainly the same person. For the first time since seeing that account code across a rain-streaked banking counter, Olivia began to suspect that Daniel Carter was not hiding something shameful at all, but something far more complicated and far more honorable than she had imagined, and the thought unsettled her more than any scandal ever could have. Word of Olivia's investigation eventually reached Marcus Reed, through channels he had cultivated precisely for this purpose, and he moved quickly to protect whatever interests he believed were threatened by the truth surfacing. Rather than wait for Olivia to uncover the full story on her own terms, Marcus began quietly spreading a different narrative through the executive floors, one that painted Daniel as a man who had been embezzling company funds through a maintenance department loophole for years. Whispers spread through the building faster than any official memo could have traveled, carried by employees eager for gossip and by executives eager to align themselves with whichever side seemed to be winning. Within 2 days, security personnel detained Daniel in the middle of the main lobby, in full view of dozens of employees crossing through on their way to lunch, demanding he surrender his access badge and submit to a formal investigation. Daniel stood perfectly still as the accusations were leveled against him, his expression calm in a way that unsettled the guards more than any protest would have. He offered no explanation, no defense, no plea for understanding. simply allowing the humiliation to happen without a single word in his own defense, as though he had long ago decided that some truths were not his to spend in his own defense. Employees who had barely noticed him for years now stared openly, whispering theories about hidden bank accounts and stolen fortunes, the story growing more elaborate with each retelling as it moved from floor to floor. Olivia, watching from a distance through the glass wall of an upper conference room, found herself strangely reluctant to intervene, still uncertain whether the man Helen had described and the man now being paraded through the lobby as a criminal were truly one and the same. Part of her wanted to walk down and end the spectacle immediately, but another part of her, the part trained since childhood to verify everything before acting, told her to wait until she held proof rather than instinct alone. She hated herself a little for the hesitation, watching Daniel stand there in silence, while dozens of people who had never once thanked him for a single kindness now openly celebrated his apparent downfall. Marcus escalated his campaign by producing what appeared to be damning financial statements, showing hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through accounts connected to Daniel over the years, framed in a way that made the money look stolen rather than repaid. The documents circulated among board members within hours, and sentiment shifted rapidly against Daniel, with several directors calling for immediate termination and criminal referral before any formal hearing could even be scheduled. Whispers turned into open accusations, and by the end of the second day, most of the building had convinced itself that the quiet maintenance worker was, in fact, an elaborate fraud who had exploited the company's trust for over a decade. Olivia sat alone with the documents Marcus had circulated, scanning each line with the same rigor she applied to every acquisition she had ever evaluated in her career, refusing to let a single figure pass without justification. Something in the numbers refused to sit comfortably in her mind. A discrepancy so small, most people would have overlooked it entirely, buried in a footnote, referencing an internal transfer code that did not match the format used anywhere else in the company's history. She stared at that single anomaly for nearly an hour, feeling the same instinct that had first pulled her attention toward the routing code at the banking counter, now pulling her toward something Marcus clearly had not expected anyone to notice. It was the kind of detail an experienced auditor might catch, but only if they were looking specifically for something that did not belong, and Olivia Harrington had spent her entire career training herself to notice exactly that. Whatever Marcus had built to destroy Daniel's reputation, she now suspected it had been constructed on a foundation that would not survive genuine scrutiny. Rather than accept the documents at face value, Olivia authorized an independent forensic audit conducted entirely outside the company's normal channels, staffed by external accountants with no personal stake in the outcome and no loyalty to Marcus Reed whatsoever. The auditors worked around the clock for 3 days, tracing every transaction back to its original source, cross-referencing dates, signatures, and authorization codes against records that Marcus had never expected anyone to examine so closely. What they found dismantled the entire narrative Marcus had constructed, revealing that key figures within his supposedly damning statements had been altered. Dates shifted slightly, decimal points moved just enough to transform a modest repayment schedule into something that appeared far more sinister on paper. Olivia read the final report twice, then set it down and sat quietly for a long while, understanding that a man's entire reputation had nearly been destroyed by a handful of moved decimal points. The truth, once fully reconstructed, told an entirely different story than the one that had spread through the building like wildfire. The money Daniel received each month was not compensation, and it was certainly not the product of theft or manipulation on his part. It was, in fact, a structured repayment, honoring a promise Edward Harrington had made and signed personally many years earlier, long before Olivia had ever been given full access to the company's oldest financial records. Daniel Carter, the auditors confirmed without ambiguity, had committed no crime, engaged in no deception, and benefited from nothing beyond the return of what had once genuinely belonged to him, a fact that made the accusations against him feel almost cruel in hindsight. Attached to the report was a single scanned document that had been buried for 14 years in a sealed legal file, a handwritten letter bearing Edward Harrington's own signature, outlining the exact terms of a private agreement between two men who had chosen honor over recognition. Olivia read every line of that letter twice, struck by how plainly it was written, with none of the legal complexity she had expected from a document worth so much money, only a simple promise between one man who had been saved and another who had asked for nothing but quiet repayment. When the findings reached Marcus Reed, his composure finally cracked in a way none of his colleagues had ever witnessed before. He demanded to see the audit personally, insisting there had been some mistake, some manipulation on the part of outside accountants who did not understand the complexity of corporate finance. But the evidence was unambiguous, documented meticulously, and impossible to dismiss. And within the hour, security escorted Marcus to a private conference room to await questions from the board's legal counsel. The man who had spent days orchestrating another person's public humiliation now found himself facing the very same fear he had tried to inflict. And for the first time, panic replaced the calm arrogance he had worn so comfortably for years. In the private conference room, waiting for legal counsel to arrive, Marcus finally admitted to a junior associate that he had always resented the quiet maintenance worker, who seemed to move through the building untouched by the same ambitions that drove everyone else, never once suspecting that the very humility he mistook for weakness was the thing that had saved the company he was now trying to control for himself. Edward Harrington discharged himself from the hospital against his doctor's cautious recommendations, insisting he needed only one more day of strength to finally set the record straight before his daughter and his entire board of directors. He arrived at Harrington Tower dressed in a simple gray suit rather than his usual tailored formal wear, looking older than Olivia had ever seen him, yet somehow more resolute than he had appeared in years. He requested an emergency session with the full board, a meeting that included Olivia, several senior directors, and, at his specific insistence, Daniel Carter himself, who arrived still wearing his maintenance uniform because no one had told him to bring anything else, and who took a seat at the far end of the table, as though he still believed he did not belong among them. Standing at the head of the long conference table, Edward began to speak in a voice that grew steadier with every sentence, as though the truth had been waiting patiently for permission to finally leave his chest. 14 years ago, he told the room, this company stood on the very edge of total collapse, brought there by trusted partners who had manipulated contracts, hidden liabilities, and nearly destroyed everything 3 generations of his family had built. Daniel Carter, then a young and brilliant financial analyst working quietly within the firm, uncovered the scheme before anyone else recognized the danger closing in around them. Rather than simply reporting the fraud through ordinary channels, Daniel had personally guaranteed emergency loans using nearly every asset he owned, negotiated directly with furious creditors through sleepless nights, and structured a recovery plan that saved the jobs of tens of thousands of employees who never knew how close they had come to losing everything. Edward paused there, gripping the edge of the conference table for support, and looked directly at Daniel for a long moment before continuing, as though asking silent permission to finally say the rest of it aloud. After 14 years of silence, Daniel gave the smallest nod in return, and Edward seemed to draw strength from that simple gesture. Straightening his shoulders and continuing in a voice that no longer wavered. In doing so, Edward continued, his voice catching slightly. Daniel had sacrificed almost his entire personal fortune, walking away from the crisis with nothing but the quiet satisfaction of having saved a company that would never publicly acknowledge what he had done. Edward had offered him equity, a permanent seat on the board, public recognition befitting a hero, and Daniel had refused every single offer without hesitation. All he asked in return was a private, gradual repayment structured across many years, so that no one outside a small circle would ever learn how close the company had come to ruin, and so his own sacrifice would remain his choice alone, rather than a story told for anyone else's benefit. Edward had honored that promise faithfully every month for 14 years, and he had asked for silence in return, a silence that had protected both the company's reputation and Daniel's own quiet dignity, even as it cost his daughter 14 years of wondering what she was never told. The room sat in stunned silence, as directors who had spent days condemning Daniel now stared at him with an entirely different understanding, some visibly ashamed of how quickly they had believed the worst, without ever asking a single question. Olivia rose slowly from her chair, crossed the length of the conference table, and stood directly in front of the man she had once dismissed as simply another name on a staff roster. She apologized quietly, her voice softer than anyone in that room had ever heard it, acknowledging how completely wrong she had been to let suspicion guide her before understanding ever had the chance. Daniel only offered a small, tired smile in response. The kind of smile that carried no bitterness at all. Only the weariness of a man who had carried a secret alone for far longer than anyone should have to. "I helped your father because it was right," Daniel told her simply, "not because I ever wanted gratitude or recognition for doing what needed to be done." Olivia studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of resentment toward the years he had spent unseen and unappreciated, and finding none at all, only a quiet peace that seemed almost foreign in a world built entirely around profit and recognition. She offered him, on behalf of the board, the position of chief executive officer, insisting that no one in that room deserved it more than the man who had already saved the company once, without asking for anything in return. Daniel shook his head gently, explaining that he had never wanted power, only the simple freedom to live an honest life without the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down upon him, and the room fell quiet again, this time out of something closer to admiration than shame. In the weeks that followed, Olivia found herself drawn back to Daniel again and again, not out of obligation or curiosity about his past, but because she had never before encountered someone so entirely unmoved by money or status. Their conversations began casually. Brief exchanges near the maintenance office, or shared coffee during late evenings when the building had emptied of everyone else. She discovered a man of quiet humor, deep patience, and an unshakable sense of principle that had nothing to do with the wealth he had once possessed, and everything to do with who he chose to be regardless of circumstance. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people chasing influence and recognition, Daniel's steadiness felt like something she had been missing without ever realizing it. A stillness that made her own relentless pace feel, for the first time, unnecessary. Their time together grew from brief conversations into shared dinners, quiet walks through the city after work, and long evenings spent simply talking about nothing important at all, which somehow felt more meaningful than any business negotiation Olivia had ever conducted. She found herself laughing more easily than she had in years, softening in ways her closest colleagues would hardly have recognized, and slowly allowing herself to feel something she had long assumed her life had no room for. Daniel, for his part, seemed equally surprised by how easily trust had grown between them, having spent so many years guarding himself against anyone who might discover what he had sacrificed and why. Neither of them spoke openly yet about what was forming between them, but both understood, in the quiet way people sometimes do, that something rare had begun to take root, something neither of them was in any hurry to name or rush. One evening, walking along the river after a dinner that had lasted far longer than either of them intended, Olivia asked Daniel quietly why he had never once tried to reclaim the life he might have had if he had simply accepted her father's original offer of equity and recognition. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering, telling her that the day he chose to save the company was the day he understood that some choices are not meant to be renegotiated later, simply because the outcome turned out well. He said he had made peace with the life that followed. A quieter life. A smaller apartment. A single photograph on a nightstand. And that peace, he told her, it was worth more to him than any boardroom seat could ever have been. Olivia said nothing for a while after that, simply walking beside him under the streetlights, feeling something settle in her chest that she did not yet have the words to describe. Marcus Reed's downfall came swiftly once the full board reviewed the forensic audit, alongside additional evidence of years of quiet manipulation he had orchestrated to consolidate his own influence within the company. Legal counsel filed formal charges within days, and Marcus was escorted from the building he had once hoped to control. His ambitions finally exposed for the deception they had always been. Edward Harrington, weakened by his health, but strengthened by the relief of finally releasing a secret he had carried alone for so long, announced his retirement from active leadership, entrusting the company's future entirely to his daughter. The board convened once more, this time to honor rather than condemn, voting unanimously to grant Daniel Carter the title of Honorary Lifetime Advisor, a recognition befitting the man who had twice now protected the company from ruin. Daniel accepted the honor on one condition, insisting that the story of what he had done 14 years earlier never be made public, preferring that his sacrifice remain a private matter between the people who mattered rather than a headline for the world to consume. Olivia respected that wish completely, understanding now that some forms of honor are diminished the moment they are broadcast for applause rather than quietly lived. Under her new leadership, she began reshaping the entire culture of Harrington Capital around a principle Daniel had lived by long before she ever knew his name, that reputation and integrity carry more lasting value than any single quarter's profit ever could. Employees noticed the shift almost immediately, a renewed sense of trust spreading through departments that had spent years operating under quiet fear and competition. And for the first time in a long while, people spoke of the company not as a machine but as something closer to a family that finally trusted itself. Olivia made a point of visiting every floor of the tower personally each month, something her father had never done in all his years running the company, and she found that simply asking employees how they were doing changed the way decisions were made at every level beneath her. She kept, in a drawer of her own desk now, a copy of the letter her father had signed 14 years earlier, not as a secret this time, but as a reminder of the kind of leadership she intended to practice for the rest of her career. 1 year later, Harrington Capital reported its strongest growth in company history, driven not by aggressive expansion, but by a reputation for honesty that clients and partners had come to genuinely trust. Edward, now fully retired and finally at peace, spent his days visiting the company only occasionally, content to watch his daughter lead with a wisdom he had spent his whole life trying to instill in her. Daniel remained close to the company, though no longer in a maintenance uniform, choosing instead to mentor young analysts quietly, the same way he once uncovered the fraud that nearly destroyed everything all those years ago. Olivia often found him on the rooftop terrace after long days, watching the city lights flicker against a darkening sky, and she began joining him there more evenings than not, the two of them content to simply stand in silence long after the sun had gone down. On an autumn evening, with rain falling gently over the rooftop, just as it had on the day this entire story began, Daniel and Olivia stood together in comfortable silence, no longer separated by the distance between a chief executive and a maintenance worker. There was no title left standing between them now, no hidden account, no 14 years of secrecy waiting to surface and complicate everything they had built together. Daniel reached for her hand, and Olivia let him take it, both of them watching the rain fall over the same skyline that had once hidden so much from her without her ever knowing. They understood, standing there in the quiet rain, that the greatest value a fortune could ever hold was never measured in the size of a number on a page. It lived instead in a promise kept faithfully for 14 long years, in a debt honored not out of obligation but out of genuine gratitude, and in the rare kind of trust that only grows between two people willing to see each other exactly as they truly are.